So I'll make a start. Okay, so this web clinic today is about writing up reviews with network meta-analysis. So really, I want you to be able to bring your questions to this and discuss it with me. I'm going to go through some slides and talk you through it a bit more. I'm not going to go into what a network meta-analysis is really, because that's being covered before. But we're just going to talk about the issues that people have with and what they should include when writing up a network meta-analysis. So just some housekeeping. So your microphone's muted at the moment. You're welcome to share your camera, but we do advise to keep them off because to help with the bandwidth for everyone. If you want to ask a question, please put your hand up or write in the chat box if you don't want to speak, and then I'll answer them as we go along. So I'm going to talk about what network meta-analysis is briefly. I'm not going to go into detail on why we use one. And then we're going to go on to look at key quality markers for network meta-analyses and a protocol template that we've developed, as well as going through a worked example about what was included in that particular review. So if you think things apply to you, you know, or if something's different, please just speak up and we can discuss that as we go through. Okay, so starting off with pairwise meta-analysis. So this is when we're looking at just comparing one intervention versus another, and we use a forest plot to display the results from the individual studies and then produce the pooled effect estimate. But with network meta-analysis, it's comparing 3 or more interventions. So you can see here in this network diagram, actually there's quite a lot of interventions being compared here. So one of the things that is asked to include in a review is a network diagram for each outcome, because you may have different data for each outcome. And why use a network meta-analysis? So when thinking about what patients or clinicians or policymakers want, they're not really wanting to necessarily compare one treatment to another. They want to know what is the drug of choice for a given condition out of all of the different interventions available, which is the best, if you like, intervention to use. And the key quality markers for are similar to a standard intervention review in some respects, a pre-published protocol. So published in the Cochrane Library or registered in Prospero, for example, and a well-defined question. This is important, obviously, with network meta-analysis, because it needs to make sense. You need to justify why the network meta-analysis is needed. Clear inclusion and exclusion criteria, again, that's not specifically different to a standard intervention review, but we do need to think about the assumptions for network meta-analysis, including transitivity. So that's just making sure that in theory, the participants could have been randomized to any of the different interventions included in the review, and also how similar the different interventions are. So, for example, if you were looking at a placebo arm, in some studies it was given by an injection and in others a tablet, it mightn't be suitable to actually include those together. And also looking at the potential effect modifiers across the different trials as well, and making sure they're balanced. So, for example, if you had all children in one trial and adults in another, then it mightn't be suitable to include those within the same network. A comprehensive search strategy is important. Again, that's no different than a standard intervention review, but your search terms might include all of the different interventions that you're interested in here. And again, dual study selection, data extraction, and risk of bias assessment, that's no different. The study characteristics need to be well defined, again, similar to a standard intervention review. And then appropriate data analysis and presentation of the results. So here it's really important that you have an experienced statistician on board the team that knows about network meta-analysis and how to conduct the analysis and the relevant tests there. And then basing the conclusions on the review findings. Again, that's no different to a standard intervention review, but you've just got more interventions to consider. and minimal well-justified protocol deviations. And in Cochrane reviews, we include this in the differences between protocol and review section. And again, this is no difference really to standard intervention reviews. And there is a PRISMA extension to network meta-analysis as well. So following PRISMA for network meta-analysis is important. So this is a study that we undertook looking at Cochrane protocols that included network meta-analysis, and some items were reported well, but there could be further improvement, especially discussing the transitivity assumption within the reviews. So the recommendations from this paper were that protocol reporting recommendations were needed, and from this, and we were already working on a protocol template for network meta-analysis. So you can see here, this first one here, in 73% of the reviews, it was in the protocols, it was labelled as network meta-analysis in the title. So not even all of the protocols identified as a network meta-analysis within the title, which is one of the PRISMA recommendations. 53% considered the transitivity assumption when reporting inclusion criteria. And 95% justified the need for network meta-analysis. So you can see the different criteria varied quite a lot. So there is still room for improvement. So this was the protocol template I mentioned. It's not, it'll be available soon on the knowledge base. So the website's there. And this recording will be made available afterwards on our website. But the protocol template isn't about cutting and pasting exact text. It's about advising what you should include in the different sections in the method section. Okay, so the review I'm going to go through and focus the example on is uterotonic agents for preventing postpartum hemorrhage. It was updated to include a large WHO trial, and it was funded by the NIHR, and had a mix of different experts included. So first of all, we're in the why is it important to do this review in the background section, they justified why they were undertaking a network meta-analysis. So you can see here the yellow highlighted text, the individual uterotonics described are being compared in existing Cochrane reviews, and all comparisons are based on trials that directly compared one against another and head-to-head trials. In the absence of a single randomized controlled trial comparing all available uterotonic agents, uncertainty remains over their relative effectiveness and ranking. So it's telling us here that there's many different independent comparisons, and there's an absence of head-to-head comparisons, and we need to resolve any inconsistent findings, and also ranking treatments might be a particular reason. But the most important rationale for justifying network meta-analysis is that the review addresses a question involving multiple interventions. Okay, another part was the WHO recommends that all women giving birth should be offered uterotonics during the third stage of labour for the prevention of postpartum hemorrhage. So this is also bringing in the transitivity assumption, so that women could have received any of the different uterotonics, and the participants are equally likely to have received any of those different interventions. Okay, so when looking at considering studies for this review criteria, it's important to bring the transitivity assumption in here. So under types of interventions, we've got for this review, we assume that any woman who meets the inclusion criteria is, in principle, equally likely to be randomized to any of the eligible uterotonic agents. So here they're clarifying that patients are equally likely to receive the treatments. And And it's also important to check the number of interventions included so that it's large enough, so that the review is comprehensive and answers the question, but it's small enough so that it's clinically meaningful as well. So obviously that's quite hard balance to get. And obviously it's really important to involve a knowledgeable clinician in the process. And it should also include a decision on lumping or splitting nodes of the network. So how are you going to deal with different doses, different timings? For example, are you going to lump them all together? Are you going to have them all separate? And what about unspecified interventions? Will they be considered post hoc for inclusion in the network? So interventions that you might not have thought of, but you identify trials including those. Okay, so this shows the network diagram. As I mentioned before, it's really important to look at this for each outcome, because some of the included trials in your review might not necessarily report on every outcome that you're interested in. So the network could vary for each outcome. And this shows a lot of information here. You've got the number of trials. So if we look at this biggest comparison here, you can see that by the size of the nodes. So the nodes are the interventions. And you can see these circles here are really big. So misoprostol and oxytocin are the most common interventions that have been looked at. And we've got the information here. So 44 trials. There's 44 trials that make this comparison, and 36,920 participants are included within those trials. And then the colours as well. That's the certainty of evidence. So this is orange is low certainty evidence here. And then you've got red is very low certainty. And then you've got moderate certainty for the light green, these ones, and then the darker green is high certainty evidence. There are alternatives to producing a network diagram, such as tables or presenting a contribution matrix as well, and that the information for those is available in the handbook. But actually displaying your network for each outcome is really important. Okay, so moving on to data synthesis. Here for this review, they've got methods for direct treatment comparisons and methods for indirect and network comparisons as well. So sometimes review authors will still undertake pairwise meta-analysis. So they need to present the methods for those, and also for the network meta-analysis as well. It's important to specify the statistical model, whether you're using a Bayesian or frequentist setting, whether you're using fixed or random effects approach, a multivariate or hierarchical model, and how you're going to account for the correlated nature of multi-arm studies as well. In many of the statistical programs, this can be accounted for within the model, but it's important to know what that particular model does and specify that in the methods. And also talk about the assumptions about the heterogeneity, variance, and the method for estimating it as well. And there is a multitude of different software that's available now. R is free. You can use Stata, WinBugs and OpenBugs and JAGs, use Bayesian meta-analysis. And there are also these apps now, the Meta Insight and NMH Studio, where you can upload the data and that will do the analysis for you as well. So, it's important to know which programs you have available to you or to your statistician, and what will be best for you, your team. Okay, Gisette has asked, would it be possible to see the recorded video of how to do a network meta-analysis? You missed it. Okay, there is a network meta-analysis webinar series that is available on Cochrane Learning, so that's free to access. So if you go into Cochrane Learning and look for network meta-analysis, I don't know whether Rachel could maybe find the link and post it in the chat. There is a webinar for each part. So there's a webinar on creating the protocol and trying to specify your question. There's a webinar on Meta Insight, a webinar to use Cinema, which I'll go on to talk about, and a webinar on grades. and then we did a webinar on editorial considerations as well. So depending on where you're up to in the process of the network meta-analysis, that should hopefully be able to answer your questions. Katie, what's the rationale for doing individual pairwise meta-analysis in addition to network meta-analysis? Is this always done? No, not necessarily. I think but it depends on the data that's available. So in advance, you might not know what the network would look like for a particular outcome, or if the transitivity assumption will be violated. So you might want to specify that, if there isn't enough data to undertake a network meta-analysis, then you might want to revert to a pairwise meta-analysis. So you need that option, or if the transitivity assumption you find is violated, then that's an option as well. I mean, it might be for some outcomes that you are able to undertake a network meta-analysis and others you aren't, and that is one of the things you should specify as well. You should specify which outcomes that you plan to undertake the network meta-analysis on. Is there a minimum number of articles required to conduct a network meta-analysis? So I've got a slide at the end. I wonder if I could just jump to that. Sorry, I'm just trying to find. So hopefully you can see this diagram here. Rachel, let me know if there's a problem. You can see intervention A, B, and C. So this shows a very simple network. So you might have, this gives an example. So you've got doctor versus dietitian and dietitian versus nurse. And this allows you to calculate an indirect estimate between doctor and nurse, because you might have any trials that make that comparison. So actually just having those trials, you can you get the indirect estimate. So I mean, it really depends, because obviously the more complete the network, the more precise the estimates are possibly going to be. So obviously, like with a pairwise meta-analysis, the more trials that you do have, the more information that you have available. So it's similar with a network meta-analysis as well, but you just got to think about the different assumptions with network meta-analysis as well. So there's not necessarily a standard number that you need. It's just whether it makes sense to do. There's another question. Okay, Kathy, I think we always perform pairwise meta-analysis together with network meta-analysis, as we want to know whether inconsistency between direct and indirect comparisons, right? Yeah, so, but when you undertake the network meta-analysis, you will usually get the direct, indirect, and the network meta-analysis result, which combines the direct and indirect estimates as well. So it's whether you just do that. So in the program that you will use, that's what the output it should give you. But some people still do the pairwise meta-analysis in RevMan as well. So you just need to think about what you want to do. And later on, I'll talk about the amount of data that will go into RevMan as well. Does that make sense? So basically, when you run the code, it should give you the direct, the indirect, and the NMA. But some people do it separately. So, but if you didn't have enough data, or the transitivity assumption was violated, then you might not undertake the network meta-analysis for a particular outcome, for example. So that's when you would just do pairwise meta-analysis alone. Incoherence. So yeah, this is what you were just talking about, Kathy. So looking at whether the direct and indirect evidence agrees with each other. So it's good to think about this within the assessment, when you're talking about heterogeneity as well. So one of the issues we found with people writing protocols for network meta-analysis, they might have network meta-analysis in the title, but then the first time it's mentioned in the review is actually in the data synthesis section. And as I've shown, it needs to be thought about right throughout the protocol. You might not necessarily need to mention it in every section, but I've pointed out different sections that we really need to think about mentioning it and just thinking about the particular issues in. So there are different methods. So here it says to check the assumption of consistency in the entire network, we use the design by treatment interaction model as described by Higgins. And the different methods are available in the handbook with obviously references to the papers they're based on. So it's important to look at global approaches for assessing, for evaluating incoherence. So this is looking at statistical incoherence in the entire network. So thinking about that diagram, the network diagram I showed you, it would look at, is the indirect direct evidence sort of, does it agree across the whole network? And you can use design by treatment interaction models and I-squared. And then the next part says, however, we note that confidence intervals for both of the network meta-analyses and direct evidence were overlapping across all comparisons, suggesting locally consistent results. I think they meant indirect estimates here because, as I said, when you're looking at coherence, you're looking to see whether the indirect estimate agrees with the direct estimates. And there's local approaches as well. So within one loop, so that loop I showed you, dietitian versus doctor versus nurse before, they're the local approaches just within the loops themselves. Where if you've got the global approach, which is the whole network. So going back to that example, there was only direct evidence with doctor versus nurse, but actually, sorry, there was indirect evidence. But if you'd have had direct evidence as well, that's when you can compare the direct evidence versus doctor versus nurse with the indirect evidence, and that allows you to assess the incoherence or coherence. So I've gone through the method section, and as I said, it's important to think about it in some of the different sections within the method section and not just in the data synthesis section. But then thinking about the effects of interventions, it's really important on presenting these so they make sense. Because with some of these reviews, there is a lot of information. There's a lot of interventions, as I showed you in that network diagram for uterotonics before. So it's really important to be able to present it so that someone can read it well, so it's easier to read. So this shows you a league table. So it's got the different interventions that are color-coded here, and then the effect estimate here. So this 1.25 with the confidence interval 0.99 to 1.59 is comparing this purple intervention to this grey intervention. Sorry, I'm not sure what the abbreviations are for. And this is just for one outcome. So here it's serious adverse events. And I'd say as well, it's important to note what the effect estimate actually is. Is that a risk ratio, for example? And so these effect estimates in the bottom left-hand corner are the results from the network meta-analysis, so combining the direct and indirect evidence. And these in the top right-hand corner are the direct estimates. So these will be what you would get from the pairwise meta-analysis, for example. And these ones are color-coded grey because they're statistically significant. So there is lots of different ways people have presented these, and it can be a bit more difficult to do in RevMan because of the way the tables are. Some people have included them as figures. Some people have just typed them up as tables into RevMan. But it's really important to present something like this to see the comparisons, because I think there was one network meta-analysis that I've seen recently that just presented all of the different interventions compared to placebo. But that's not necessarily what you're interested in. What you're interested in is, given these 10 different interventions and placebo, what are the effect estimates? What's the differences between these treatments? So what can an NMA achieve? A relative effect estimate. So this is what I was talking about before about the output. So it should give you the direct evidence. So rather than presenting the league table here, they've presented the results in a forest plot. So, but for each comparison, they've got the direct evidence, the indirect evidence, and the NMA estimate as well. So they've done that for the different interventions. So you can see here they've got oxytocin versus placebo or no treatment, and then going down all the different interventions compared to placebo. Then you've got ergometrine plus oxytocin versus oxytocin. So you've got the different comparators in here as well. So you can see whether you prefer to present it as a forest plot like this or as a league table like this. It's important to present the level of heterogeneity as well and incoherence in the network. So going back to those methods that we specified for local and global incoherence, it's obviously important to specify the results for those. Here they put there was evidence of global inconsistency in this analysis, where the direct and network randomized evidence were not in agreement. Yeah, again, I think that should be indirect. And also, you may notice in the literature that sometimes inconsistency is used and sometimes incoherence are used, but it's used to mean the same thing. But we tried to move away from using consistency so that it doesn't get mixed up with the grade considerations. Okay, Vasiliki, you said what's the best software to produce these figures? It can be produced in most of those, in most of the software that I have already mentioned, or I'm sure all of them. Oh, sorry, you're talking about the forest plots or the league tables or the network diagrams? The forest plots. The way those forest plots were done, I think that was done specifically for example, in Stata, and they've input the values. But most of the different software programs they'll have a guide on producing the figures. So it depends what software you're using for the analysis itself, because you use that software to do the analysis anyway. So it makes sense to sort of stay in that to produce the figures. Because I think you're using R. Yeah, you should be able. You'd be able to program it in R. I'm not sure whether the code for network meta-analysis in R would output that automatically. I can look into it for you. I know we're talking on Monday, so I can have a. Okay, you haven't found a way yet. Okay, I'll have a look. I'll have a look into it for you and let you know. Okay. So then there's treatment ranking as well, thinking about what's the best and worst intervention. But these aren't substitutes for the relative effect measures. It's really important to report the relative effect measures with their confidence intervals as well. And there are lots of different methods of ranking to use. There's a really useful paper that Georgia Salantes recently published, talking about the different ranking methods and what they actually mean. Oh, and Adam, sorry. Sorry, I'll come back to that. Yeah, so it's really important to think about what question you're trying to answer when you decide which method to pick to rank the interventions. So here they've used Sucre, and they've produced this cumulative probability plot of what is preferred. So you can see here this ergometrine plus oxytocin was the highest ranked, if you like. But as I said, it's important to think about what question you're trying to answer. And Sucre tries to answer which treatment has the largest fraction of competitors that it beats. So that's what it's saying, that ergometrine plus oxytocin has the largest fraction of competitors that it beats. Anne has said for R, there's a package for Frequentis network meta-analysis named NetMeta with a function forest. Brilliant, thanks Anne, that's really helpful. So if anyone is interested in producing the forest plots, you could use that function. It might be worth looking it up to see what it or use it and see what it gives you, and then you can usually adjust code in R as well to get different things on the forest plot. Okay, so for the review that I've showed a lot of examples from used photonic agents, so that it's really important to be able to get across what the findings of the review are, because sometimes these reviews are so large that a lot gets lost within that. So it points out that the relative effects from the network meta-analysis suggested that all agents were effective for preventing postpartum hemorrhage when compared with placebo or no treatment. And the 3 highest rank agents were ergometrine plus oxytocin combination, which I just showed you on the graph, misoprostol plus oxytocin combination, and carbetocin. And then it also gives the effect estimates as well for the different comparisons, along with the certainty of the evidence. And there's also the RB MEN tool as well that assesses risk of bias due to missing evidence in a network meta-analysis. So what we think of as publication bias, so unpublished studies that we don't know about, and also studies with unavailable results as well. So you may have 20 trials you've included in your review, but only 10 of them present the results that you need for a particular outcome. So it's important to consider those other 10 trials and think about if they actually measured the outcome you're interested in and didn't report it because of the results. So I'd suggest that's obviously a very recent paper, so it's worth having a look at that if you're interested in applying that risk of bias tool. And also thinking about reporting bias as well, there's a comparison adjusted funnel plot as well that shows that the different comparisons on the same forest plot as well. So you can see here they're all color coded. But as with a standard intervention review, there are other reasons for funnel plot asymmetry as well. So interpretation needs to consider that. And then assessing the certainty of the evidence in the method section, it's really important to specify whether you're going to use the grade approach or cinema. They're both accepted in Cochrane reviews. They're both discussed in the handbook. And as I said, there's a webinar on both of those as well that we did a couple of years ago. So you can use either of those. So when indirect comparisons are built on existing pairwise meta-analysis, which have already been rated with respect to their confidence, it might be better to use the grade approach. However, cinema, if you're building your body of evidence from scratch, or there are a large number of interventions, it could be more useful to use cinema as well. And then going on to think about summary of findings tables. It's really important to think about these in advance because, as I said before, there can be a lot of information in a review with network meta-analysis because of the number of interventions and comparisons that are often included. So it's really important you think about how you're going to summarize those. So you would want to pre-specify how you're going to construct your summary of findings tables. So in standard intervention reviews, this is done by comparison, and then you have your 7 outcomes within that summary of findings table. But for network meta-analysis, it's been suggested that it's more useful to look at an outcome and then include the different comparisons as the rows. If you have more than 5 interventions, you might want to select and report a reduced number. So you need to think about the rationale for what you include. So you might want to think about the direct interest for conclusions or what's most important for clinical practice. So this just shows you an example of the summary of findings table. So here you've got the estimates of effects, credible intervals and certainty of evidence for chemoprevention of colorectal cancer in individuals with previous colorectal neoplasia. So you list your patient or population, which you do with in standard intervention reviews, the interventions, so you list all of the different interventions that you're considering, the comparator, so here we're comparing it to placebo in the summary findings tables, and here the outcome as well. So this is prevention of advanced neoplasia with the range of follow-up being 3 to 5 years, and the setting outpatient. So you can see here as well, it's got the network diagram on, but that unfortunately that's not possible to do in Cochrane at the moment. So you can't include the network diagram in the summary of findings table. And then you've got your different comparisons here, your different interventions here, which are compared to placebo. So you've still got your relative effect. So this specifies this as the network estimate. And then you've got your anticipated absolute effects, the certainty of the evidence with the footnotes for downgrading. And this also includes ranking as well. Although the comparing multiple interventions methods group recommend that we don't include ranking in the summary findings table at the moment, because it can be misleading unless you've considered the question that you're trying to answer. Thinking about the comparator, you might want to have the placebo or a gold standard treatment, or the most cost effective or the least effective intervention. But it's good to pre-specify that, because unlike the league tables, you can't show every different comparison. So you couldn't show folic acid versus vitamin D unless you did even more constructed more summary of findings tables. So going back to the uterotonics review, this was their summary of findings table and the outcome for postpartum hemorrhage. So you can see they just constructed one table for that outcome. And then they've got their reference was oxytocin, and then it's got the different comparators here. And again, but here they've done it a bit differently. They've presented direct evidence, indirect evidence, the network meta-analysis result, and the anticipated absolute effects as well, and the certainty obviously as well. And they produced this risk of bias plot, but we really need to think about how risk of bias plots are presented as well, and again depending on whether they've used risk of bias 1 or risk of bias 2, because you can imagine that if a study has looked at several different, it's a multi-arm trial, the risk of bias between intervention A and B might be different to that versus B and C. So if you're using risk of bias 2, we would ask you to pre-specify which comparisons that you're going to assess, as well as which outcomes that you're going to assess as well, because that would be used to inform grade. So when a network meta-analysis is planned but not feasible, I've already touched on this. So the protocol may plan for the network meta-analysis, but it's not possible in the full review because of the lack of studies or the transitivity assumption, for example. So it'd be useful to keep the network meta-analysis methods in the review in some form, such as an appendix, so that in future versions of the review, if it is possible to do, you have got your methods there rather than just deleting them all. But again, this sort of touches on why some people include methods for pairwise comparisons as well. So if it's not possible to do a network meta-analysis, they can undertake the pairwise comparisons. So just some final considerations really, and then people can ask any more questions that you have, or any discussion if you've got a particular example. So a good review, whether it's a standard intervention review or a review including network meta-analysis, it'll follow the pre-published protocol. It'll report methods transparently. It'll assess the risk of bias of included studies and present the findings accessibly and base conclusions on the review findings. So presenting the findings accessibly is one of the most important things with network meta-analysis, as I think I've said a few times now, just because of the amount of data that it often generates. So yeah, so there's some resources here. So we've got chapter 11 in the handbook and in the version 6 of the handbook. There's a website for the Comparing Multiple Interventions Methods group. Training, if you go onto the online learning, there's a module you can do, network meta-analysis. If you're a Cochrane author, this was free. The recordings from the webinar series are available and they're free to access. And contacting us in the method support unit if you're undertaking a Cochrane review, and then we're happy to help advise where we can, and we can meet with you and discuss any issues that you have. And these are just some of the relevant references. And this paper here in the American Journal of Epidemiology is the paper I was talking about with ranking. So if you are thinking about ranking in your review, then I think it's really important to have a look at this particular paper, because it's, as the title says, it's introducing the treatment hierarchy question in network meta-analysis. Because I think in the past, a lot of people haven't given much thought about which method of ranking they're using, and they'll just pick one because they've used it before or they've been advised to use it. But it's really important to think about what that actually means using that method.